Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to join you every weekend. We've been doing this show for the last 20 years. And boy, this is like the best weekend, one of the best weekends to have the opportunity to share with you information, news, analysis about what's going on in Mexico, both in English and in Spanish. But this weekend is particularly interesting, not necessarily of what's going on here in Mexico, which a lot is going on. As you know, we've been following very closely the judicial reform and judicial elections in Mexico. We had a long interview last weekend with a former member of the Federal Electoral Institute. But this weekend in particular, we are, of course, trying to understand the impact that Donald Trump has and his policies has had in Mexico since he's been in power only 100 years. So it's just a great moment to kind of sit back, breathe in deeply, and start trying to understand what not only the impact of these decisions on Mexico's economy, Mexico's commerce, but we got to start figuring out where all of this is going and the impact it's going to have on all of us. Yes, Donald Trump's decision is also going to have an impact for all of us living here in Mexico. Joining us once again is Juan Baker. You know him well. He's been joining us throughout the years. He's the former Deputy Secretary of Economy. He had the responsibility of negotiating or participating in the negotiation, particularly the one that you and I have discussed a lot, Juan Carlos, is the USMCA, which was a fascinating negotiation that took place 6 years ago, right? I mean, I think that's when, it was the agreement was reached 8 years ago. And now, once again, there's a lot of conversations and trying to understand, well, what is the future of global commerce, global economies, and what's the future of Mexico's relationship with the United States and Canada based on this, what appears to be a new strategy of Donald Trump trying to change the way commerce is and tariffs are viewed in the United States and the world. Welcome to the show. So where are we 100 days into Donald Trump's government?
Thank you, Ana Maria, for having me as always. There's a lot to unpack on what you just said, but let's start with the basics. I think that if we look back at what has happened in the past 100 years, or a little bit more than 100 years, between Mexico and the States, I fair to say that the Mexican government has been able to. What I'm trying to say is that, given that he came back with a vengeance and that there were all these crazy and super quick decisions that he made, the number of executive orders that he has signed just in these 100 days, I think it comes close to 100, maybe a little bit more than that. So it seemed that at the beginning, it seemed that the Mexican government, like any other government around the world, was going to be just overwhelmed and run over by Donald Trump. And I think it's fair to say that it really hasn't happened. Of course, the Mexican government, Claudia Sheinbaum personally, but the government as a whole, have developed a lot of effort and have put a lot of and have developed a strategy to try to avoid conflict to the maximum extent possible. And the reality is that of those declaration or very harsh remarks that Donald Trump has given or has expressed about other leaders, we really haven't seen that in the case of Mexico. So I think that we have managed that. Let's put it like that. Now, regarding tariffs, the specific question about tariff of yours, I think that again, if we looked at what he said on day one and then fast forward the picture to where we are right now, I think it's also fair to say that President Trump has attempts to deliver on what he mentioned about raising tariffs, about taking actions on what he believes are abuses by other countries in which the U.S. always get the shortest stick and other countries get the best part out of the deal. That again, all of this is what he claims. It's not necessarily true, but this is what he claims. And in any case, that's really what drives, at least in terms of the economics and trade, that's really what drives the agenda, his beliefs and how he thinks that those mistakes, quote unquote, should be addressed. So what he has done in terms of uh, increasing tariffs, in terms of poking holes into the USMCA, well, clearly those actions have had some consequences already very visible. I think that the fact that the US had its first economic contraction for the quarter, I think in like 3 years or 4 years, it's very indicative of how these decisions really are going to put into question the strength of the US economy. In the case of Mexico, obviously, given how dependent we are for our economic activity, how dependent we are on exporting to the US, any measure that the US takes that somehow cuts our access to the US market has the potential to really hinder Mexico's economic development, correct? And that is why I think that the strategy of the government in terms of negotiating exemptions or trying to find windows through which the Mexican exports can continue to enter the U.S. Has been, obviously a priority. So I think it's fair to say, putting it all together, I think it's fair to say that we have avoided the most dire and negative consequences of Donald Trump's return to the White House. But the question that we all have, well, not all of, that I keep constantly asking myself, is okay. Well, all of that is very nice and it's very useful, certainly. But what now? What happens now? We cannot really be chasing or trying to come up with new ideas every time that Donald Trump wakes up and thinks of doing something, right? We need to have a comprehensive strategy. We need to have an inclusive agenda with the United States that, yes, obviously takes care of this, that we are not going to be hammered uh, with tariffs because of other items on the agenda that are also being pursued by Donald Trump, no?
Joining us today is Juan Carlos Baker. We're having a little bit of problems with your audio, Juan Carlos, but I think it's much better now. The issue here, Juan Carlos, is trying to figure out, and I'm sure this is going to be considered one of the most difficult negotiations the Mexican government's had with the United States, just simply because Donald Trump is so unpredictable, and in many ways. But like you said, he promised that he was going to do this, and now what becomes unpredictable, at least from my perspective, is what is going to stop him, or at what point will a decision be made that this whole view of this new strategy of using tariffs as a way of assuring that more, businesses come back to the United States, that, that this would be a way of increasing tax revenue, which is the other reason they've said that they've been doing this strategy as a way of increasing revenue for the government so that they can reduce taxes. But more importantly, this argument that, that manufacturing jobs will come back to the United States, and that in many ways, the suffering that the U.S. voters are living through right now will eventually be compensated because there will be more jobs and people will be paying less taxes. That's, I think, is kind of the argument that they propose, and they believe that. And at what point they're going to realize that this is not going to work, or it's just too painful, it's to be seen. But for Mexico, assuming that Donald Trump is going to keep going down this road, where do you think what role does Mexico play in this realignment of the U.S., not the U.S. economy, the world economy, based on Donald Trump's decisions? I mean, there is such thing as the USMCA, and it has to be renegotiated next year. But it's just, I'm just wondering, what is the validity of having a trade agreement if you have a president like Donald Trump just changing his mind every 20 minutes?
That's a very good question, and I think it's very relevant to what not only what we're seeing right now, but the decisions that will have to be made in the next few months. Let me start by addressing or by saying by sharing my views on why I think that the USMCA is still relevant. In the previous question, I was telling you that the Mexican government was able to negotiate certain exemptions and certain windows that permit that Mexican goods continue to be exported duty free. All right, and all of that in the justification of those exemptions and those windows, right? The U.S. argues, and that's how Donald Trump wrote it, but not himself, but how it is spelled in the executive orders, formalizing that agreement, that Mexico is a partner under the USMCA, correct? Now, for those products that are manufactured in Mexico that do not comply with the USMCA rules,
Mhm.
those products, which is a sizable amount of Mexico's exports, about 40% probably,
Mhm.
all of that chunk is not given. Okay, so there and then uh, you are seeing that the USMCA may be beaten up, maybe a bit dismissed by the US.
Mhm.
It is still
We're having problems with your
valuable
audio, Juan
nonetheless,
Carlos. Here, I'm going
because
to stop
any
you.
future reference will depart from the.
We seem to have some problems with your audio. Joining us today is Juan Carlos Baker. As you know, he's been
Is it
joining
better?
us throughout the years. Yes, I can hear you now.
Yes, sorry.
That
Maybe I'm just gonna. I moved. I'm sorry.
that's so he's been joining us throughout the years. We've been having some problems with audios and videos almost all day long. For whatever reason, the last 2 or 3 days, I've been doing different interviews and trying different interviews with different people talking about this 100-day mark of Donald Trump as president of the United States. And it's been rough because we have we've been having these audio problems and video problems. Are you back, Juan Carlos? Juan
I
Carlos
am
Baker?
here. Yes, can you hear me
Yes,
well?
I can
Yes,
hear
I'm
you
sorry.
perfectly. So let me ask you this. So why don't you continue? Because I need you to finish your idea. We were talking about, in certain way,
Sorry about
the, the
that.
difficulty
What I was saying
of
to you.
yes, yes,
No,
continue,
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt. No,
continue.
well, yeah, sorry. What I was saying to you is that, well, I still believe that the USMCA is relevant, and I see that in the sense that the exemptions or the windows that were provided to Mexican exports were justified under the premises that there is a USMCA. Okay. Now,
Mhm.
obviously, we cannot be naive, and we must understand, and we must be prepared for the moment, which is not really far ahead, where
Mhm.
Donald Trump will wish to just ratify entirely its relationship with Mexico.
Mhm.
And now, what does that look like in terms of trade, investment, and so on? And I believe that this is the point that touches upon the other element of how is the average U.S. voter going to react when they realize that everything that Donald Trump promised them is
Mhm.
probably either not going to happen, or it's going to take longer than what they expected, or is going to be more expensive.
Or
And
very
that's really where
painful. It's
Mexico.
going to be
Oh
very
yeah,
painful, very,
very
very
painful.
painful. Yeah.
And that's where Mexico comes in, because it is just an economic fact that the U.S. cannot go into the self-sufficiency path that Donald Trump and his advisors believe that should be the U.S.'s goal. So they need to they need to have the cooperation of countries that help them be more competitive, that can complement their manufacturing strength, and that can complement the resources that they need. Okay, that used to be China for a long
Hello, I'm here, Juan
China,
Carlos.
provider of cheaper goods and
Mhm,
provider of raw materials and so on. But now China is no longer politically someone that the U.S. wishes to have closer to them. So
mhm,
that's where Mexico comes in. So I'm not saying that we are going to go back to the 1990s world of the NAFTA, where free trade was the norm. I still believe in that concept, but I think that the political reality is telling us
mhm.
otherwise. But even in those circumstances, even if the U.S. does not accept it, acknowledges publicly that they need Mexico, well, that's just the reality, right?
So, I've been wanting to ask you this for a while, and I think it's becomes especially relevant now that Canada has a new prime minister. Um, a prime minister that wasn't supposed to uh, replace Trudeau. The Liberals were supposed to lose. I mean, because Trudeau's popularity had fallen in a very important fashion. And of course, Donald Trump comes into office, starts assuring that Canada is going to be the 51 state of the United States. And he even wrote that a message on the day of the elections in the United States, insisting that Canada should become the United States' 51st state, which I'm sure actually helped Carney to win. So now there's a new prime minister in Canada. So what happens now? And I mean, how does Mexico and Canada go forward? Because, and this is the question I wanted to ask you. I mean, are we potentially facing the possibility that the USMCA disappears and we basically will end up with two bilateral agreements, United States with a bilateral commercial agreement with Mexico and the United States with a bilateral commercial agreement with Canada? I mean, is that possible? I mean, so where are we then with our relationship with Canada?
Well, two, three ideas. First, I think that the relationship with Canada, despite being a very close ally and despite being, a country that is friendly to us,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
Sometimes
despite
not.
well, sometimes
Sometimes
not, but
not. Yeah.
it's all about the politics. I would argue it's
Mhm.
not really
Right.
really the average belief of
Right.
the Canadian citizen. No? But
Mhm.
despite all of that, the reality is that under the previous administration in Mexico, we did not pay as much attention as we should have to the
Mhm.
Canadians, and that obviously led to some downgrading, so to speak, of the relationship. That
Mhm.
we were not necessarily the best partners of Canada and Latin America. No, I mean
Mhm.
we didn't really attend it as we should have. Now, in this present moment, the relationship between Mexico and Canada, I think, has to go through two, maybe three objectives. And the first one is,
Mhm.
obviously the renegotiation review of the USMCA that you just described.
Mhm.
Legally speaking, technically speaking, the agreement has three parties, and thus any discussions about it and about its future
Mhm.
have to be approached by the three parties. It's not possible that Mexico and Canada, or Mexico and the US, or Canada and the US decide to do amendments or to
Mhm.
change the spirit of the USMCA. So that's the first objective. Mexico and
Mhm.
Canada need to come up with I'm not saying a joint strategy, because follow its objectives, but at
Mhm.
least some communications, at least some realization that we have a bigger fish to fry, so to speak. No?
Mhm.
The second objective that I think needs to be taken into consideration when framing the future Canada-Mexico relationship is what do we want to do in the future? So
Mhm.
some of the Canadian businesses and some of the Canadian interests are present in areas where the Claudia Sheinbaum administration has been very explicit about what it wants. Mining, water, natural resources, energy, things like that. So some
Mhm.
of the interests of Canada clearly fall square into those areas where the current government has made decisions, will continue to make decisions, And well, there needs to be some understanding there as to what's going to happen. And lastly, I would say that the other objective is precisely what Mexico and Canada wish to do in the face of how the relationship with the United States will continue to be. What I'm trying to say is that even if right now Donald Trump, even if we renegotiate the USMCA, even if we have other objectives in the future, it is clear that the US, and I'm quoting Prime Minister Carney, it is clear that the US is no longer that reliable partner, friend of ours that will come at our aid under the most dire circumstances, correct? So
Right.
if that is the case, well, Mexico and Canada, as I said at the beginning, we are partners in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We have other interests in the OECD. We are common friends with countries in Asia, in Europe. So we need to start diversifying, I mean, Mexico and Canada, our bilateral relationship from the sort of gravity pull, if you allow me, that Washington has on us. And I'm convinced that there are several areas and things that we can do, Mexico and Canada, once that we open that door. Maybe for the wrong reasons, because clearly what's happening in the U.S. is not pretty or is not ideal. But even if for the wrong reasons, crises at the end of the day tend to be great opportunities, no?
Juan Carlos Baker, we unfortunately ran out of time. I really appreciate you joining us once again here on Living in Mexico. Thank you. Thank you so much. And boy, I had so many questions to ask, so you have to come back really soon.
And whenever you invite me, I'll be happy to join.
I love it. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was Juan Carlos Baker. He's literally been joining us throughout the years. I think some of the first times I had the opportunity to interview him is when he was at the Ministry of Economy. And of course, we talked frequently with him as the Mexican government was moving forward with the negotiation of the USMCA. So I really enjoyed talking to him.